Before I get to those readings, I'm going to give you some tips on how to read challenging text so that you can, hopefully it's helpful for you. And I'm actually going to use one of the PDFs to show you how you can approach those. So I'll take it to a share screen. Before I do, I always like to remind you that if you have questions or comments, if you need to take breaks to take notes while you're watching this video, please feel free to pause. Also, feel free to email or message me with any questions or concerns you have. I'm sorry for looking scarier than normal, usual. I shouldn't say normal, there's no such thing. There's some plumbing going on in my house. So if you hear any like loud noises, that's what's going on. I just wanted to warn you in advance. So I'll take it to a share screen. I have two different pages of notes to share with you, and then we'll look at one of the readings to consider how we approach it. All right. So first off, I want to talk about reading tips for 103. And so when you're reading, a lot of us, especially in this world, in this culture, everything tells us to go, 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 speed up, ramp up, do more, accelerate, take on more. And I really want you to consider ways in which you can push against that. Maybe not in every part of your life, but at least in parts that are meaningful and that require a little more concentration, thought, pensiveness, etc. One of those places that we can do that is reading. Now, when I was in college, I was the same nerd I am now. I loved to read. I was an English lit major. I would read about 1,000 pages a week. And I remember I had a classmate in one of my English classes who said, how do you read so much? You must speed read because that's a lot of reading to do. And I said, well, actually, I don't speed read. I take my time. I actually often slow down, reread, come back to the reading so that they actually make sense to me, so that they're meaningful, so that I can apply them in a critical way. Because if I'm just barreling through it and half the time I've got the grocery list in the back of my head, or I'm not really concentrating on the deeper, close meaning of the text, I'm going to lose a lot, right? So that scares a lot of people because they think it's going to be time intensive. And I'm not going to lie to you, at the beginning it may be, but it's kind of like riding a bike, to use a very tired cliche. You get into certain patterns, and then once you are used to those patterns, it comes very naturally to you. So keep that in mind when we're engaging in these readings, to take your time with them. And so when you're reading, the first thing I always tell people is slow down, right? Don't speed up. Slow down, let the ideas marinate. If attention is something that is challenging for you, as it is for many of us right now, then read in increments. Don't read the whole reading in one sitting if you can't. If you start to notice that you're distracted, that maybe you're hungry, maybe your body is telling you it needs a rest, maybe your brain or your eyes are telling you that they need a rest, then take that rest and come back when you're a little better recharged, so that you can approach that reading. Even set a timer if you're worried that you're going to rest and then forget. Set a timer, give yourself a 30-minute rest or whatever, however much time you have, and then come back to it. As you're reading, you're not, none of us are going to be experts on these things. That's why we're students, we're learning. So as students, we need to constantly be asking questions. And one of the most important questions we can ask while we're reading argument is why. Why is this person telling me this? Why is this a problem? Why is this an issue? Why should I care? Why does this relate to my life? Any and all why questions are going to be really helpful for you, especially in terms of generating that critical thought that we need to have to be good writers, to be good students, to be good rhetors, to be good people and citizens. So always be asking why as you're reading, but it's not enough to just ask. You got to make sure that you're documenting the questions and the thoughts and the takeaways that you have, right? But before we get to that, we also have to remember that there is the rhetorical triangle. Some of you may have become familiar with this in a previous class, maybe in your 100 class. Maybe it's you've never heard of it, and we'll talk about it now. But the rhetorical triangle, and there's this great little infographic here, is an infographic that helps us to remember the main parts of an argument, that an argument needs all of these things in order to essentially be an argument. And those are the author, the audience, the purpose, and the message itself, or the argument, or the text, whatever you want to call it, right? So we have the author. That's the person creating the text. It can be a writer, it can be the director of a film, it can be the rapper of a song, it can be a sculptor of a work of art, it can be anyone who is creating any text to send a message to the world, to send a message to somebody else. So the creator of the text, the rhetor, the orator, the author, these are all synonymous. Then we have the purpose, right? Why is this author, this writer, this creator, this artist, rhetor, orator, whatever you want to call it, them, why are they crafting this text in this way? Why do they want us to know this message? Why did this person who wrote this short story write this short story? Why did this person who created this warning label create this warning label? Why did the person who directed this film, make this film in this way? So we have to go back to that why in terms of purpose. We also have to think about the audience. Who is the audience? And don't just say everyone. It's a cheap way out of really thinking critically about who the audience is. If you think about the purpose, right, and you think about the person who's creating the text, they've got specific people in mind whom they wish to inform, whom they wish to persuade, whose minds they perhaps wish to change, or maybe they're just commiserating, right? Maybe they're just venting to an audience that will understand and agree with them. But you have to look at the whole text and all of the aspects of it to gauge who you believe the audience to be. You have to do that for the purpose as well. And so, if we think about, Meg Thee Stallion's Body Yaddy Yaddy, Meg Thee Stallion would be the author. Her purpose in creating it would be, perhaps part of this whole body positivity movement, perhaps also to raise people's spirits in a really crummy year in 2020 with a happy, fun song, maybe to make some money through TikTok endorsements, who knows? But depending on what we know about Meg Thee Stallion and why we think she created that song, then we can consider, okay, who might the audience be? Well, maybe it's people who care about the body positivity movement. Maybe it's women. Maybe it's people who create TikToks. Maybe it's anyone living in America in 2020 who's bummed out and likes that genre of music and wants a little emotional boost, right? And so when we know all of those things, then when we look at the message or the text or the argument, again, these are all synonyms, whatever we want to call them, we can start to understand it in more depth in a way that we perhaps only thought about it superficially before, okay? So think about those things. Also think about the genre. Is it a rap song? Is it a scholarly journal article? Is it a work of literature? Is it a poem? Is it a sculpture? Is it a multimedia presentation? And if whatever the answer to that is, why did that artist, why did that writer or orator use that specific genre to convey that message, right? It would be kind of weird if Body Yaddy Yaddy were an entire novel. Wouldn't make sense, right? The fact that it's a sort of, rap hip hop genre song, dance song, is appropriate to the author, the purpose, the audience, and the message, right? When you start to consider the text that you're looking at, you can always take notes manually by hand. A lot of us have it on our computers so we can type and highlight. But one thing that might help as well is to take your phone and actually voice record your ideas. This always helps me. I go for a lot of walks, and sometimes my best ideas come from my walks. When I'm thinking about these texts, I can voice record and then come back to them, and they're still documented in a way that's helpful for me. All right, so let's talk about going to the text. First, we will look at pre-reading. So when you pre-read a text, you want to look at the title, right? Also, look at the length of the piece. You know how I just talked about attention span and maybe time constraints and things like that? Maybe you can't read that whole piece in one sitting. Maybe you can, but maybe that's not conducive to your life and who you are. So then look it over and say, okay, how much can I read right now? How much can I set aside maybe later today? How much can I set aside tomorrow? And as you're reading, again, always check in with your body, not just the intellectual, but the emotional, the physical, right? If you're getting tired, if you're distracted, if you're bored, address that issue and then come back to the reading so that you can be fully aware and absorbed in it. As you're reading, if you encounter unfamiliar words or things you don't have a lot of background knowledge of, what I would say to do is put a box around them. Put a little box around unfamiliar words and then define them. You know, go to a dictionary, either online or paper, or if it's a historical thing, you know, read a quick article about the biography of the person or the historical movement so that you know enough. And then define or understand that thing a little bit better and then reread it in context so that it makes sense, right? There was an old thing that some of you may have learned in high school called context clues, where they told you to like jump over the word and ignore it and try to figure out what it means based on, you know, the rest of the paragraph. Now that we're getting it into the college level, you can't always do that because some of these words, these terminologies are incredibly complex and are attached to situations that we have no prior knowledge of. So we have to do a little background research as we're reading. All right, so if it's a PDF or if it's an online reading or maybe it's a rental and you can't write on it or you can't highlight or you can't take notes, you may need to pull up a separate sheet like this, right? Like this Word document right here, or maybe a physical sheet of paper and take your notes. The best thing that I would do, right, and I'll show you this in the man reading in a second, is for every time you take notes, put the name of the author, put the title of the reading, right? And then as you go, write the page numbers. And I'll show you where the page numbers are on the PDF so that you know how to properly cite them, okay? So let's say page 4, and there's the beginning of a sentence. And that beginning of that sentence is where the quote you want to remember or document is. You don't have to write out the whole thing, right? Because that's going to take a lot of time. But if you can write like the first few words of the sentence and have the page number, then when you go back to it for either a discussion board or for an essay, you have all the information that you need not only to find the quote and use it, but then to cite it properly. You have the last name of the author and you have the page number. So that will help for those of you who have, again, types of readings that you can't highlight or write on themselves that you need a separate document for. If you can highlight or write on themselves, and I'm right here for those of you following along, do it within the margins of the text, right? Highlight, box unfamiliar words, underline important words or phrases. Create a system that works for you, okay? Maybe a smiley face means you agree. Maybe a frowny face in the margins means you disagree. A question mark means you're going to come back to it. A star means it's very important and you may use it in an essay. You know, it all depends on whatever method works best for you. Some people color code, like the way I've color coded these sections. Some people color code their highlights so that one color means stuff that they need to define and reread in context and come back to. Another color highlight might mean stuff that's important. Another color highlight might mean like counter arguments they want to address, right? So that's another way that you can utilize this. And then, you know, for later on, once we get to the writing process, I want you to remember that you're writing on a text because we're not expected to be experts, right? Because this is English 103 and not, you know, year 8 or year 4 of your PhD. It does not need to be perfect until you hand in the final draft. We're exploring, we're learning, we're dipping our toes in the water at this point. So focus less on perfection and more on creativity, critical thought, again, the connection between the emotional and the intellectual, et cetera, during the process. Save all that revising, proofreading, and editing for last, but make sure that you do it, and make sure that, you know, when you hand in a final draft, it's polished, it's final draft ready. So taking some of these reading tips, I want to show you the man reading really quickly. Let me see if I can pull it up. I'm going to take it off share screen for just a moment so that I can find it discreetly on my computer. This might be a good place for you to stop and maybe be pensive, take a break, whatever you wish. Okay. All right, I'm going to take it back to the share screen now. All right. So this is the same PDF that you'll see on Canvas in reading Kate Manne's chapter from this book entitled, and this chapter is called Indelible. Okay, the reason why I gave you the title page and then the publication information is so that when you get to the works cited page of your own essay and you want to cite Kate Manne, you have all the information here that you need. You have author, title of chapter, title of book, date of publication, and you even publisher, you even have the page numbers. You don't see it on the first page, but then when you go down to the next pages, you'll see the page numbers upper left and right hand corners, depending on the page. Okay. So if we look at the title, we have two titles, right? We have the title of the book itself, entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women. And then we have Indelible, on the entitlement of privileged men. Okay. So some of you may be reading those titles and your own biases might be seeping in already. And what I mean by that is you may be saying, oh, great, I got to read something by a man-hating feminist, right? Check your bias as you're reading. Make sure that you rein that in and you become a bit more objective. On the same token, right? If you're like, yay, I'm reading one of my feminist sisters, hooray, check that, because man may say things with which you disagree. Not all feminists are created equal. Not all feminists are women, right? Not all women are feminists, and she talks about that too. And so you don't want to just sit with your preconceived notions of what you think those concepts to mean when you approach this text, right? You want to be as dispassionate as possible. Doesn't mean you have to agree with it, right? You can definitely disagree once you've read the piece. But the problem I see with a lot of people is they see titles like this and they automatically say, nope, I'm out. Don't want to read that. And it's unfortunate because they really miss out on some complex, helpful arguments, and they learn about topics in a way that is not typically disseminated to us in things like social media, mainstream media, et cetera, right? Social media, mainstream media want us all to think that, feminists are just angry and hate all men, and that all feminists are women, and that they're all women just sitting back, grinding an axe, waiting for the next man to anger them so that they can scream at him, right? And that's not the case. People all along the gender spectrum can be feminists. Again, people all along the gender spectrum can be anti-feminist or misogynists. Really, all a feminist is, and someone who believes in gender equality across the gender spectrum. And so, if you don't agree with that, right, if you think anyone other than cis hetero men should have fewer privileges in this world, then yeah, you're not a feminist. But if you think that everyone should have the same rights according, regardless of gender, then you're a feminist. Live with it, deal with it. So anyway, that's a digression. So I want to come back to this, right? So you read the title, you get over your bias, whatever it may be. You look at the length, right? So we see here page 3 of 8, but you know me, I put 2 pages on each PDF. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 pages of reading. And look, the font's pretty big, you know, the book is a hardcover, so it's not like dense information. It's pretty doable. So I would say this might be 1, maybe 2 sittings, right? Depending on how much time you have, how tired you are, what your engagement with the material is, etc. So as you're reading, do those things that, you know, we talked about in the notes, right? Maybe you don't fully know what the word entitlement means. So then you go, you know, yellow highlighter, entitlement. Maybe you don't know the Brett Kavanaugh case. So you make a little note about who's Brett Kavanaugh. Maybe I'll Wikipedia what that case was all about. Maybe you see something about himpathy and you've done a little a little work up front and see that that's in the discussion board. So you highlight that or put a star next to it, right? And so as you're going, you're building your case, right? Just like Quintilian talks about with a good rhetor, you're building your case. Again, doesn't matter if you agree, disagree, feel neutral about Kate Manne, you need to gather evidence to build a case for anything, for, against, neutral, etc. And the way that we do that is by gathering evidence in the text and then outside of the text, right? But right now we're looking at in the text. So you go through, you box some familiar words, you reread them, you define them and then reread them in context. That's the important part, so that when you read again, it makes more sense. You get through the whole reading and then again, wed those emotional and those intellectual responses. Think about how you feel about what Kate Manne says and not just your summary of it. You have to do both. You can't do one or the other. You can't not read and have a feeling about it, because that's, charlatanism essentially, but you can't just be able to summarize it and not formulate an opinion, because that's the whole point of this class, right? So make sure you're doing all those things. All right,